Hi, I'm Lisa Kaplowitz, the co-founder and executive director of the Rutgers Center for Women in Business. And I'm here today with my esteemed colleague, Colleen Tolan, our postdoctoral research associate. And we're here today to talk about some of our recent research about advancing gender equity without deepening polarization. Colleen, this was really your idea. What inspired you to think about gender equity without deepening polarization? Why did it feel so urgent right now?
Yeah, so we are the most polarized we've ever been. That is not a secret. It's everywhere on the news. And I think some conversations that you and I had led me to kind of look into the research around that and what is really happening with different initiatives, and especially as it relates to gender equity. And there was some really interesting research to come out of Pew that said that men and women have both progressed. But when you asked men and women how we were doing consecutively, everybody agreed that women are doing better. And most people thought men are doing slightly better, maybe the same. And then there was a decent chunk of people who thought men are really doing worse. And as gender equity researchers, I feel like this raised a lot of red flags for us because we know that gender equity requires not only for everybody to be involved, but also to acknowledge that progress and change enacts feelings. And if men and women were having different feelings about gender equity progress, that was worth looking into because some of those initiatives might not continue to progress forward if at every step it felt sort of like a loss for men. And this was a conversation that you and I had a bunch of times,
Yeah.
but it felt hard to put real language and data to that. Sometimes it's hard to acknowledge those feelings as something real. But we recognize through the Pew data and through some other studies that people were feeling differently about gender equity and that was at risk for deepening polarization rather than working towards our very goal in this initiative of gender equity, which is bringing people together.
And I think one of the things that we really discovered, which seems so obvious, is that it's perceptions, not just policy,
Right.
that's shaping the discourse and shaping how we can really move forward together at companies to really create these work environments that work for everyone, which obviously includes women as part of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would like to hear your take on what you think specifically about this paper was urgent to women in business.
Whoa. Can I say everything? Everything around us, the news cycle, our social media, everything seems to be pulling us farther apart. And we're living in these echo chambers. So our viewpoints are continuously getting reinforced, and we're not getting challenged to talk about our views at all.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting. Some of the other research that we've done focuses on power. And the big uncovering that we had was that men equate power with control, and women equate power with freedom. I'm just going to let that sit. But I think that in and of itself creates this urgency that we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
So, Colleen, this ties into a lot of your academic background and some of the conflict theory that you've done before. How does this all relate together?
Yeah, you were just talking about that paper on power, which looked at perception differences. And the foundation of so much conflict work is we perceive the world around us so differently. You and I are two people in a room, and we have maybe two completely different perspectives of just even the stimuli in this room, right? And so acknowledging that. A lot of the conflict work says, how can we start with common ground? So, how can we acknowledge that we see things differently and find those pieces of common ground from which we can build upon? And what we know is that companies are more profitable when they are more diverse. And gender equity in abstract is a great idea. Everybody should be on board. And not only will your companies make more money, but your workplace will be more collaborative, et cetera. However, the impact of that doesn't always feel that way. And so, starting from that sort of common ground, how can we establish shared values and start to build equity efforts around that common ground was really the first piece of this. And then the second piece was moving from common ground and really getting men involved. So not just
So important, by the way.
yeah. And I learned this from you, starting to work at the center, and you talk so much about getting young boys involved and how important it is for men to be involved. And I think often gender equity research discusses men being involved in women's initiatives. And really, what this paper wanted to do is go beyond that and say this is an everyone issue. What affects women affects men, and vice versa. And so now that we have this common ground, we have this shared value of a more equitable workplace that is beneficial to everyone. How do we bring men into that? Not just say, hey, can you do this women's thing, but how are you interested in changing your workplace in a way that benefits you as well and doesn't feel like you're have to see, you have to fight for your job or you have to fight for a specific space. Instead, you're sort of expanding that workplace to allow for more creativity and allow for more growth. So that was really the two pieces of this that I thought a lot about in terms of conflict is common ground, shared values, and then this inclusive nature and collaboration of working together.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And as you know, that is the foundation of the center. We have been inclusive from the beginning and intentional because when we make the workplace better for women and everybody, we're also making it better for men. We're allowing men to have the permission to have that culture accept the fact that he might take advantage of those practices like flexible leave, like paternity leave, and not get punished for it. And
Yeah.
that helps him and that helps families and that really helps everybody.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'm curious always because you have such a extensive background in the industry side of things. What do you think leaders need to know? How can leaders get involved? And even from your experience in the C-suite, as we get higher up, how can leaders sort of really engage in gender equity initiatives without deepening polarization?
I think it's interesting. And a lot of what's happening in corporations, we're seeing within academia as well. Men think it's moving too quickly. Women think it's not moving fast enough. We have to acknowledge both these perceptions because, again, that's what's going to ultimately have policies come together. So it's really important to involve men and to involve their experiences, but also it's important to ask the questions, not to blame men, not to shame men about what the challenges are that women are facing, but how do we educate? Ask men, have you ever not gotten a job because you became a father? Have you ever had to leave early to pick up the kid and were you penalized for that? Have you ever been asked, well, maybe he doesn't want to go travel because he just had kids? And it's really asking him those questions that women get asked all the time. How do you do it all? And so I think it's coming together to understand our different perspectives that really is what leaders need to do. And the biggest thing is to ask. Ask. Ask her if she wants that promotion. Ask her if she wants that stretch assignment. Ask her what her career aspirations are. And don't assume. And this is important because if teams aren't aligned, it impacts dynamics, it impacts productivity, it impacts innovation. And so it's very important for us to really understand these different perspectives. Okay, we've talked a lot about shared goals, and refocusing that is great in theory. But how do companies do it in practice?
Yeah, this is the $1,000,000 question. So one piece of this is that we talk often about equity initiatives as being non-zero sum. And what we mean by that is that we don't have to, the women's advancement doesn't have to come at men's expense, right? But what we don't often acknowledge in the same breath is that change feels like it's coming at somebody's expense always. And there are many times in which a company only has two jobs. And if a man loses out on that job to a woman, it's very easy to feel like that was at his expense. And so, re
But we also know it was never his job to have in the first place.
right,
The
right.
most qualified person should have the job.
Right. And well, and that is exactly sort of where I was headed, right? Which is that reorganizing our understanding, especially from leadership, about what it means to give the most qualified candidate the job is really key here. And so it does take really strong leadership who all stacks hands on that initiative and says, this is what matters most to us, that the best ideas win, and that in that it's going to feel different, but the reality is, and the statistics support this, that there is no difference, right? That actually equity is valuable for everyone. And the other piece of that, and really valuing the best ideas winning, which I feel like you and I have talked a ton about, is eliminating what's called groupthink, right? Which is the idea that once I get in a room and I'm talking with people, all of a sudden our ideas congeal around the same person who happens to be the loudest, is usually a man, sometimes talking over someone. And sometimes when we talk about groupthink, it's easy to be like, of course that's bad. We don't want everyone to think the same thing. We want diversity of thought. But what we don't realize is that even when it's good, even when somebody says, I think everybody should get raises and we should hire more women, that seems objectively good, there's still a loss of perspective that is really helpful for growth. And what we know is that when you have those different ideas and there's a little bit of friction, people get really creative and they get invested and they find purpose. And so without that, without those differences of ideas, and when you're tempted to sort of fall into this groupthink, you end up in this place that is holding your company back. And so, like you said, it's sort of getting those leaders really engaged and helping them sort of lead the charge on this is what we're about and this is what it includes. Men, women, non-binary folks, everybody here are sort of a part of this initiative of creating a more equitable workplace.
I think that's so important.
So, in terms of leadership getting involved, there are these ideas that are really important. What are the tactical steps that companies can engage in to really make this hit home?
One of the most interesting things is that many companies already have them. They're called employee resource groups, business resource groups. A vast majority of organizations have these, but a vast majority of employees do not belong to them.
Mm.
And so they have this tool, this opportunity to be the voice of the customer for their employees, both their employees and also their customers, because their customers most of the time come from different backgrounds and lived experiences. And it's really taking advantage of this group of folks, this community, to better understand your customer needs, to better understand your employee needs, to create that environment to service both the customer being your employee and your customer that's paying. Now, one of the challenge, especially with the women's ERG, is if somebody identifies as a man, they don't they're scared. They don't think that the ERG is for them. They don't think that they belong there. They're scared they're going to say something wrong. And so it's creating that environment. And we do this through one of our programs, GAME, Generating Allyship and Male Executives, where we bring folks together without blaming, without shaming, to have these really scary conversations, to work through how to give feedback to women, to work through how to mentor and sponsor women, and to work through how using your status actually helps you as much as it helps the other person. And what we need to do from a company standpoint is invest in these. We need to pay the leaders who are running these because it is taking time out of their workday, but it's really important to create that cohesion and community within the companies, which does lead to increased retention. And so if we value them by investing in them, I think they will only be that much more productive. So Colleen, I want to end it with you. If you could leave our audience with one takeaway, what would it be?
Yeah. This is so much thought has gone into this paper. It's hard to summarize in one takeaway, but I think it might be this, which I find to be hopeful. Progress just takes time. And it's hard to not get discouraged when that progress ebbs and flows. And so much research has come out, and we've seen so much development in the gender equity space. And I believe in a more equitable world. We're closer to that than we were 20 years ago. That's a wonderful thing. And so keeping that in mind and moving towards the difficult things like polarization, or like the fact that we might perceive these differently, or like the fact that it might feel like a loss to some men, and going boldly towards that, I think is the main point here, is that it's all a part of progress, and it all sort of requires moving through those ebbs and flows with the goals and the horizon.
Awesome. We're the Rutgers Center for Women in Business, where we make the workplace work for everyone. Thank you so much, Colleen, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.